It's an incredible honor to bring life to something that's more than 3 times my age. And boy, that ratio gets worse every year. At any rate, this is about the 4th or 5th table I've made with these same slabs. And I'll tell you that they are a whole lot of work, but they're totally worth it when they're finished. That's me chopping the cord of my brand new electric planer. Luckily, I've got the tools to do a quick repair and solder these lines back together to get back into business. Just about every project comes with some kind of a setback, and this one started right away, so hopefully that's the last one I have to deal with, right? Once that was sorted, it was back to flattening this slab. There were quite a few high and low spot areas, and it took a while. It wasn't too bad, but without an actual slab flattening jig, it's a little bit of a pain. It's just a lot of back and forth. And not to mention the ridiculous amounts of dust that collect every pass. Now on this beast, I'm completely working with end grain, so splits like this are inevitable, and as you can see, there's a lot of different various cracks through the thing. To be extra sure this thing is stable, I'm going to be setting some bow ties later, but for the time being, I need to get the top part planed. Eventually I'll be pouring epoxy into all the really big cracks to fill it up, make it a solid table. But to me, the best slab is one that's nice and stable. After this thing was rough planed, I kind of read where those cracks were, and I looked on both sides to see where the worst problem areas would be in order to figure out kind of how many bow ties to set and where they should be set. I like to use the router to get the bulk of my cutting done, and then I'll go back in with a chisel and just make sure everything is really tight and close. When those bow ties just start to slide in there, I'll add my glue, which will act like a lube to help me set them down. And then when that glue cures up, they should be rock solid, and it'll keep that crack from splitting any further, keeping that spot from being overly weak. I don't know how you look at things, but when I'm looking at this, I'm seeing a topographical map. All these bow ties are like the bridges holding the land masses together over these little rivers. My last step of this bow tie challenge is to reattach that big chunk that had cracked off. For that, I cut some progressively larger bow ties just because that crack gets bigger and bigger and a small bow tie wasn't going to bridge the gap. Once that was done, I just let everything sit for a day, and the next morning I enlisted my wife's help to flip this thing so I didn't stress out any of those bow ties and cause any cracking. I just sunk a whole lot of labor into this bad boy, and I really didn't want to ruin that. And now it's on to truly my favorite part, prepping for the epoxy pour. Since we ordered the Oops All End Grain Special, I want to make sure that end grain is sealed up before I do anything. This is a red oak slab, which means it's extremely porous and it's going to be prone to bubbling. So I threw a couple coats of poly on the bottom, and then I went through with a hot glue gun to fill in the cracks from the bottom side just to keep the excess epoxy from dribbling through those. I've experimented with this a few different ways, and this turns out to be my favorite one, and it's pretty cheap to do it. I have to cover up those major cracks with this taped up board. I'm using some silicone to kind of glue it on the bottom, and then I'm going to go through with screws to attach it and let that silicone set up before I do any pouring. Looks like my camera shifted a little bit on this shot. The last bit of prep that I have to do before pouring the epoxy is to make these little dam pieces. Don't worry, YouTube, I'm not cursing there, I'm talking about the structure. I added some tape onto those boards to prevent the epoxy from sticking to the wood, and I did some hot glue welding techniques to fill in the rest of the cracks. I also found that it's kind of nice to make an extra small dam around the top so I can over pour those cracks. And it looks like somebody made a regrettable decision and didn't put on his rubber gloves. Epoxy is really nasty stuff to work with, and I will have relearned my lesson by the end of this first pour. I learned a lesson from one of my earlier tables. I didn't go in and seal all the little cracks before I did my initial pour, and that meant there were bubbles galore. Red oak has lots of open pores that release little air bubbles if you don't seal them up first. On that job, I ended up breaking out the whole pour, and it cost me time and money. So on this one, I'm not going to make that mistake. Once that skim coat of epoxy set up, it was time to start doing the actual color pour. Safety first, but I got gloves that are way too small for my hands. Remember I talked about the topographical map? That's going to really come into play here. We're actually going to make these cracks pop and look like little rivers, so we're going with that nice shimmery blue color. Since I'm working on the dreaded end grain table, this is the most tedious part. I had to pour around all these cracks and then just let the epoxy sit and soak in, and then pour some more and then let it sit and soak in. It's just an endless cycle of back and forth until those things are filled. I also mixed up enough epoxy to get the biggest voids started with the first layer. On first glance, this looks like an awful mess, but it's a trust the process moment. This is my next round of the epoxy pour, and I actually managed to fill in that one big void. I have to break out the old trusty heat gun to get rid of all the little micro bubbles that come to the surface. On a project as grand as this, it felt fitting to use the old school technique of starting a fire with a hammer. Somehow it just makes everything feel a little bit more special. On this day, I had lots of time to sit and wait for epoxy to cure, so I could either sit there and watch it all day or get started on the legs. Now, I had made this style leg before for a dining height table, but the customer wanted this one to be a high top, so I had to modify the design slightly. But I kind of kept the basis of the whole thing the same. And I'll tell you, working this solid 1-inch stock by hand is a good workout. First off, I'm making the decorative feet. With these, we're going to make them a decorative leaf shape. They don't really have to be hyper detailed, but they do need to look nice. And now the gloves are coming off because it's time for the big hammer. These leaves need to be spread out fairly thin, and sometimes that calls for extra force. After I got all that basic shaping and tapering done, it was time to move on to the actual bends. This is the extra tricky part because all 4 legs need to look pretty stinking similar, otherwise it's going to look off. That's why it can be important to make bending jigs like these to make sure everything comes out pretty close. I like to cool these down so I don't accidentally grab hot metal later. Finally, it's time to address this table again. I have to make a table skirt that these legs will attach to, and I need to make it the right size. Too big and it's going to overhang the edges of the table, too small and it might not be sturdy. Let's stick this thing together and see what we can do. Well, it looks like I'm square, or the skirt is square. I guess maybe both of those things could be true. When the seams were all welded up, I had to go back and address the legs one more time. I had to make one little bend to make sure these legs were going to hang correctly. Here I'm using the floor to make sure that the angle is correct. Once all 4 legs were bent up, I could go and try to attach everything together. This is always the trickiest part because those legs need to be pretty straight and pretty square with the rest of that table skirt. After some finesse, I got something that looked good and sat level. When I get to this point in the project, I start to lose my mind a little bit, and I have to entertain myself and just hope that everything's going to work out. Because this table is so tall, I didn't want those legs to have any chance to be spindly, so I'm going to make a cross member system in order to lock them together, make sure everything's going to be as sturdy as possible. So all I did was make the simplest little fishtail scrolls on this bar. And now to try to set them in place and hope that it looks good. I'm thinking that'll work out fine as a simple solution. I don't want the base to be too ornate because I really want the top to stick out and pop. I also added some extra leg supports to make the legs feel and look a bit beefier and just stabilize everything a little bit further. When I was satisfied, I went in to start grinding and making sure all these welds were cleaned up. I also remembered that I have to be able to attach this base to the tabletop, so I found some nice pieces of flat bar buried in my scrap pile. With projects like these, everything constantly gets heavier until we get to the end. But now I can move on to the paint job for these legs. I started in with my primer and then moved on to a nice subdued black color to finish it all off. When I get to this phase, I start to get excited again because I know it's all coming together and it's working out. Now I have to unmold these bottom boards and hope that they pop off easily. And I have to do everything a little bit gingerly so I don't break the slab or my back. Here's to hoping the big board comes off as smoothly as that small one did. And the moment of truth. It looks like I probably missed a screw. Or maybe I just lost all my screws. Let's just readjust and try again. A little persuasion later and I was on the road again. I have to get that excess silicone ground off the bottom and then start working on the top to smooth it out before we can do our skim coats. I would like to do some nice light passes over the epoxy and over the bow ties just to make sure I don't have any nasty tear out anywhere. And when that looked good, I could start everybody's favorite job, which is sanding. It's a slow process of starting coarse and then going finer and finer and finer to make sure we get all those scratches out. I also use red oak for the bow ties, but because it's from a different tree and it's side grain versus end grain, I wanted to stain those bow ties just to make them match a little bit better before we clear coat everything. Neither me or the client really wanted them to stick out too much. There were a couple times where I went a little too far with the stain, but some paint thinner fixed that right up. I also wiped a little bit on the epoxy to see what it was going to look like. I was ecstatic. The final bit of this table is just skim coating the top until it looks good. And again, since we're working end grain, I know it's going to soak in unevenly everywhere. It looks really nice at first, but it's going to come out with a really pebbly, kind of gross, bumpy texture after a while. But that's why I bought plenty of epoxy. There's that nasty texture I was talking about. But that does mean that those pores are being filled. It also reveals any spots that didn't get fully filled when I did the cracks earlier. Next up, I had to focus on those little unfilled cracks, because if I just went right into another skim coat, it's going to suck epoxy into those cracks and cause a bunch of low spots. I also went around the entire edge of the table to make sure that that was really sealed up well. And then some more sanding to make sure I knocked down all those high spots. And now I say a little prayer and hope that I got everything filled in well enough, otherwise I have to do this skim coat all over again later. I also have to hope that no bugs fly into it either, because that's a fun problem. The next day there were no bugs and everything looked beautiful. Let's have a little exploration of our river map, shall we? And there we have it. I was happy, the customer was happy, and I got to preserve a beautiful piece of history. The tree's no longer standing, but it gets to live on in somebody's dining room.